The sea smelled of sun-warmed salt and tar, and the gulls wheeled like white-edged knives against the hard blue of the Dornish sky. Daenerys Targaryen stood at the prow and watched Sunspear take shape from the haze. Spear-bright towers, bulker walls, the glittering smile of the water gardens beyond. The ship cut toward the old Martell's harbor, and her dragon's shadows slid like clouds over the shallows, sending schools of fish boiling to the surface. Drogon trilled, impatient and proud. Rhaegal and Viserion circled wider, casting brief eclipses over the long ranks of ships that followed. She set her fingertips to the rail, smooth, salt-scoured wood, warm as a living thing. 10,000 Unsullied would land behind her, men who had never broken. 1,000 Dothraki outriders waited on the decks, already restless from the sea. Miss Ande stood close enough that the soft brush of her sleeve was a steadying weight. Tyrion's gaze was fixed on the shore with the old Lannister squint, the wind tugging at his pale hair. Varys had the settled patience of a man who had chosen his weather and stood in it. The gangplank thudded down. Heat, sharper here than on the deck, rose off stone and sand. Daenerys descended into a crowd of faces, sun-browned men in flowing whites and desert dyes, spears glittering, the rippling banner of the sun and spear above them. A woman came forward, black hair bound with gold, eyes dark as a knife's shadow. "Your Grace," Ilaria Sand said, and bent a fraction for show. "Dorne welcomes you to the land of the spear and the scorpion. We do not kneel easily, but we recognize enemies when we see them. Cersei Lannister wears a crown that murdered daughters." Daenerys inclined her head. "I wear no crown that murdered daughters." "Not yet," murmured the old woman who stepped in with the weight of a dynasty behind her. Olenna Tyrell's green silks flashed like leaves in sun. "The trick is to wear a crown at all. You cannot do it with patient words, dear girl. You do it by being what your enemies fear." Tyrion exhaled through his nose. Lady Olenna's counsel leans toward the emphatic. It leans toward the living. Olenna's eyes were equal parts appraisal and warning as she studied the dragons making ash-brown arcs above the harbor. "You've brought your hammers and you've brought your fire. Good. But hammers must strike what matters." There were formal words and cool wine shaded under awnings. And then the talk turned, as talk would, to roads and supply, to passes, to ships and harbors. A map lay open on a carved table, the boneway drawn as a thin-clawed scratch, the prince's pass as a longer wound through teeth-shaped mountains. Daenerys listened, weighing each distance and each march against what she had come to do. The small folk watched from under the palms, eyes lifting from the dragons to the long ranks of soldiers going ashore, their quiet awe like heat shimmering over stone. As the sun sank, Varys approached with a raven letter bound with plain black thread. "From the north," he said softly. "You will know the sigil when you break it." She broke the seal and read by the reddening light. The hand was rough, the words unadorned. "The dead are coming. They do not recognize crowns. We need dragon glass. We need fire. If you are what they say, bring it north. Jon Snow, King in the North." She read it twice, then turned the parchment so Tyrion could see the cramped lines. He read, mouth hardening, and handed it back. "True?" she asked the eunuch. "As true as ravens and hearsay can be," Varys replied. "There are tales from Eastwatch. The Night's Watch has fewer brothers than it has walls to patrol, but they swear on the cold, and on their old vows they've seen dead men walk. And dragons cannot drive a stake into a rumor to keep it from wandering, but they can burn what is already upon the ground." "Nay." Daenerys looked to the long pale line of the boneway on the map, to the green fat heart of the Reach, to the long black stitch of the King's Road up to Winterfell, thicker there as if ink had pooled, where the old kings had made their edicts. "We could strike at King's Landing," she said, though her voice had no hunger in it. "We could burn the Red Keep. I could hear the stone crack." "You could," Tyrion said. "And you would teach the realm to be more afraid of you than of the dead." That has a caution in it. Olenna made a dismissive sound. "She could cut off the head and be done with a viper before the snow finishes the fields." Your enemies multiply if you make ash of their cities. Tyrion turned his quiet face up to Daenerys. There is more than one throne in the north. There's the one made of words and loyalty. Daenerys heard again the line from the letter, "We need fire." She thought of the House of the Undying and cold halls full of whispers. She had seen a throne, and it had been covered in snow. "I will go north," she said. 10,000 Unsullied will march with me. The dragons will fly above them, and I will bring fire where ice has tangled its fingers through the roots. Dorne will hold my harbor. The Reach will feed my soldiers. And when the dead are broken, I will come south not as a storm that kills indiscriminately, but as the woman who kept winter from smothering their children in their beds. Illyria's mouth thinned, but she dipped her chin. Dorne has its own debts with the Lannisters. We will not forget them. Her eyes cut to Tyrion like a warning. Do not ask us to forget. Tyrion's reply was a long drink of wine, his throat working. Revenge ages badly, my lady, but it is a wine I know too well to throw away untouched. They left Sunspear under a sky that looked like hammered copper. The Unsullied moved as water moves, shapeless if you watched only a corner, but a river if you stepped back. Grey Worm walked at the fore, his face a calm the way a shield is calm. A careful emptiness built for the world to break upon. He had never seen mountains like the Red Mountains, built not of the blistering red of Slaver's Bay's stone, but of layered ochres and ash browns and pale veins where old rivers had cut. But he did know passes. He knew ambush. He knew how the sun on stone could blind, and how a serpentine road could turn a march into a string of beads. Missandei rode with the scribes and the healers and the carts piled with grain sealed in tarred barrels. When the wind blew down the boneway, it came thin and harsh, bearing with it a taste of iron. She kept the muster and the count, kept the names clear and ordered. Men were less likely to vanish when their names were known and said. Some nights she slept under a canopy of rough-woven wool beside the command tent, and some nights she slept near the dragons, because their bodies gave off a steady warmth, and the sound they made when they dreamed was not unlike the sea. On the third day in the pass, riders showed their heads on a ridge like jagged teeth. Dornish spears flickered. A horn blew, one long, two short. Grey Worm raised his hand, and the Unsullied's front ranks locked shields with the clean click of metal on metal. Daenerys watched from Drogon's back, her knees tight against warm muscle, the leather of her gloves tacky with dragon sweat. The Ridge Riders did not crest. They withdrew like lizards into cracks in the rock. The sun moved. Vultures hung and waited. Sometimes the waiting is the test, Grey Worm thought. He had learned patience the way he had learned all things, with pain for a teacher and survival for reward. At Skyreach, where the prince's pass narrowed and turned the color of old dried blood, House Fowler sent down wine and dates and strings of tiny oranges whose skin peeled back like a smile. "We keep the pass," said Lord Fowler's daughter, a woman with a hawk's poise and a cut across her chin she made no effort to hide. "And we keep our word. Dorne gave you harbor. Dorne will give you the road. Your road will be remembered when ours is made, if I am allowed to make it," Daenerys replied, and meant it. She had learned in Meereen how quickly promises turned rotten when made only in public. At Griffin's Roost in the broken foothills where the Stormlands began, and their spring green gave way to the weight of autumn turning, the Lannister scouts came like skittering brown insects, quick, seeking the edges, nipping at supply chains. Randall Tarley had set his sons and his bannermen along the eastern hedgerows, with the confident contempt of a man who has killed wildlings and Ironborn, and thinks all enemies can be read from that one book. The Unsullied did not read. They burned, patient and remorseless, through brambles with torches while dragons roared overhead and melted iron to weeping. In the first skirmish, Grey Worm led a wedge through a dry stone wall as tall as a man's chest. The wall became a spill of stone, then a line of spears, then a line of bodies. The second skirmish was on a road between two orchards that had gone to rot in an untimely frost, apples lying like bruised moons in the grass. The Lannister riders bolted when Drogon stooped out of the high blue and lit the road's shoulder, so that fire ran in parallel lines like the rails of a track. "No more than that," Daenerys told him, her voice low in his ear, feeling how fire lived at the back of his throat when she spoke to him softly. "Not the trees, not the men who run, not the hedges where women hide. They took no castles, they wanted no stone to hold them down. Tyrion's maps kept them just out of the center of the Lannister power until the road bent west into the Reach, where the fields were softer and their edges more uncertain. Jaime Lannister, it was said, had taken command of the Lannister host to the south and east, leaving Cersei to coil herself in King's Landing like a viper in a wall's crack. Highgarden's fields rolled fat and gold, and its lavender beds still wore bees. Lady Olenna met Daenerys at the foot of her own white steps, shoulders straight and mouth a straight line, across which wit did not pass unless invited. "I will give you grain enough to see your army fed all winter," Olenna said, "and wagons enough to carry it, and mules with hearts better than some lords." "You are generous," Daenerys said. "I am practical," the old woman shot back. "Winter takes with a broader hand than summer can fill. The North will forgive much for bread." They sat in a shaded garden and talked of dead kings and future ones. Lady Olenna did not touch the olives, though she rolled one beneath a finger. Thoughtful. "Be a dragon," she said at last, like a benediction and a warning together. "But do not mistake a living field for an enemy. Fire is a poor steward." News rode to them in the mouth of a man too narrow to bear it. Euron Greyjoy had fallen upon the Dornish fleet like a gull pecking out live eyes. Ships burned on green-black water. Yara Greyjoy taken. The sand snakes broken. Bodies hung from masts while Euron laughed and wiped spit from his beard with the backs of his hands. Illyria Sand and her daughter taken alive and hauled to King's Landing in chains. Daenerys' hands went tight without her meaning them to. Drogon felt the change in her body and hissed. "We could turn and make an end of him on his own deck," she said, as if saying it would give her the feeling of having done it. "If you turn," Tyrion said quietly, "your men will eat their grain in sight of the city you did not burn, while winter comes down behind you. If you go on, the North will remember who brought bread and fire." The taste of restraint had always been bitter. She took the bitterness. "We go on." Between Highgarden and Bitterbridge, they met Davos Seaworth on a borrowed mare whose gray was the color of ash after rain. He rode under no banner and removed his glove to show the missing joint on his finger, as if it were a heraldry of its own. "Your Grace," he said with a short, honest bow that did not make a show of kneeling. "I've seen kings, and I've smuggled onions with less ceremony than this. But I bring you a straight word and hope besides. I serve Jon Snow, who did not ask to be king and is tired of being one already. He asks you to bring your fire north where it matters. I've no love for prophecies, but I've known cold. None. Die. Antire." Missandei translated his rough words for the officers from Astapor, the cadence of the common tongue blunted by the miles it had walked with her. Daenerys listened to the echo. "Fire where it matters. He says he's king," she said softly. "Does he know what it costs? He was murdered on a wooden table under a black banner by his own men for doing what was right," Davos said. He glanced at Tyrion, and there was recognition, like an old scars pull. They had both stood on a wall full of wildfire once, and watched men burn. He did not stop. He does not know how. "No." "Then bring him this word," Daenerys said. "I come not to take his hall from him, but to keep the night from taking it. I will ask no kneeling now. When the dead are turned to shards, we will see what throne you're happy to pretend exists." Davos grinned, as if at a private joke made by the gods and poorly told. "They say Targaryens are mad. I've had practice making unmad choices," Daenerys said, and smiled without humor. They crossed the Mander in its slow brown coil under a sky that had lost its blue depth. Clouds came in flat-bellied, iron-edged, and the wind shifted its shape. The Reach's autumn gold dulled, then paled. At Ashford they saw the first flurries clinging to thatch in the trees. The men of the Reach muttered and pulled their cloaks close and looked toward home, as men did when the air changed. Daenerys bought not only grain but the men to haul it, and the promise that if they deserted to return to their families, they would not be hunted for choosing bread over honor. Tyrion drew up contracts, and Varys counted the days in the mouths and made the numbers tally with a grace that looked like guessing until you saw the ledgers. Between the Blue Fork and the Red Fork they passed the blackened stones of the Twins, where no Frey banners flew and no bells rang. The river smelled of old ash. "The girl," whispered one of the river folk, passing Missandei a sack of turnips with the quiet gratitude of someone giving what hurt him to give. "They said a wolf girl took their heads and baked them. They told it as a horror story. I tell it as justice." He looked up at the dragons shrinking and widening on the sky, a child's wonder collapsing into a wary man's fear. "You keep them leashed," he added, under his breath, and moved away as if he'd said something dangerous. They found the Brotherhood without banners in a ruined sept with one blue window left. Beric Dondarrion's eye socket glowed with reflected firelight. He had lost the patch, lost 3 more lives, lost a measure of his anger and none of his purpose. Thoros of Myr drank with an old man's carefulness and said little. "We've seen them," Beric told Daenerys by the thin heat of a straw fire. "Over the shivering sea, their footprints filled with frost that would not melt. Near Eastwatch, a line of them walking out of the fog like a bad idea you had and forgot. And there it is at your gate anyway. They don't hunger. They don't fear. They don't fear. They'd only act." "You are sure?" Tyrion asked quietly. Beric held up his burned sword, unlit. "I am sure," he said, and his mouth twisted. "Light or no light." They passed Moat Cailin, which squatted like a tired animal in the neck, moss-threaded thick as a maiden's braid. The Crannogmen shadowed them, appearing in reeds and vanishing with the professional grace of men who had learned the art when the world was still young. A boy with reed-woven armor rowed a boat across a trickle of green water to hand Daenerys a string of smoked fish. "For the road," he said, and looked up at Drogon with naked curiosity. "My father says you've come to kill the cold. He says the first men had no patience for kings, and neither do the last ones. But he says fire's fire." "Nay. What is your name?" Daenerys asked. "Reed," he said. "Of course," Tyrion murmured, mischief unable to help itself. They reached Barrowton in a world reduced to gray and white and the intermittent mud color of men and horses. The Barrow Mounds were half lost under snow, their stones like crooked old teeth. Northern bannermen appeared out of white, like ghosts hunting their old graves. The first words exchanged were not polite, but they were honest. "The last time a dragon came north," said Lord Serwyn, beard rimed with frost, "there were bodies on spears and a cry in the air that said, 'Burn me, burn me, and never mind who else burns.' The last time the dead came south," Daenerys said, "there were bodies in beds and a different kind of quiet." "Jon says you'll help," Lady Mormont said in a voice that could have split ice. "If you make him look like a fool, I will put your head on a pike if I have to climb one of your monsters to do it." "Noted," Tyrion said under his breath. Daenerys did not answer. She looked at the girl and saw a piece of herself at 13. Fierce, because the world had called her weak. Certain because doubt had been a luxury she'd never afforded. "If I fail your king," she said, "I expect you to try." Winterfell opened its gates with a sound like a sigh. Smoke lifted thin in the cold air, and the godswood's red leaves, few as they were, burned against the white like a wound. In the great hall, heat lived in the stone near the hearth, and smart cold lived everywhere else. Jon Snow stood at the foot of the high table, hair salted with frost, eyes the color of a storm moving in. He was not pretty, and not shining. He looked like something made to endure. "Your Grace," he said to her, with the absent courtesy of a man whose mind was already on another task. "Welcome to Winterfell." She watched the people in the hall as much as she watched him. Sansa Stark sat like a carved thing and spoke softly to the men at her side, attention pared thin as a blade. A tall woman in white armor stood a half step behind her, and a little to the left, hand resting on the pommel of a sword with a French name. The old knight with the kind eyes, Davos, stood at Jon's right shoulder. And there, in shadows not entirely made by the fire, a slight man with a rat's smile and a fox eyes. Littlefinger had a way of being behind whoever held the chair. "You came," Jon said, as if it surprised him even as it pleased him. "I did," she said. "Not to demand your knee. Not yet." Murmurs skittered. Someone coughed in a way that wanted to be a laugh and failed. Jon's mouth lifted a fraction. "You brought dragons," he offered. "I brought soldiers who know how to hold a spear," she replied. "The dragons come where I go. They're poor at listening to other people." He took her to see the forge, where smiths bent over steel that would kill a man easily and fail a White Walker without sound or fuss. Gendry, son of a king and of a city's small sins, worked there with a heat that did not leave him even when he stepped back from the anvil. "You," Tyrion said, an old memory loosening in his voice. "Well, this is a long road from the rushes and your father's black hair." "I liked the rushes," Gendry said placidly. "But this is better. This is work that matters." He held up an arrowhead of black glass set carefully into a sheath of hammered steel. "Some good men took a boat to a place with a lot of ugly stories attached to it," he said. "They filled the boat with a cargo that didn't rot. They nearly died and they nearly didn't, but here we are." He set the arrowhead in a lined box like a winter-born treasure. "There isn't enough, but there's more than there was." "May. Dragonstone," Davos said. "Slipped past Euron like a thief." He tapped his chest with 2 fingers. "Old tricks." "You'll have more boats from White Harbor," Sansa said. "Wyman Manderley loves a bake and a bargain. He loves the North more." She did not waste a glare on Daenerys. She measured Tyrion instead, and he accepted the accounting as a penance. That night snow fell in a slow, patient sift. Daenerys slept badly in a room that had held the air of other women's breath for centuries. She dreamt of a room of ashes and a throne of iron swallowed by white. In the morning, she went to the battlements with her gloves in her teeth and her hands bare to the snow, so she could feel the cold as a living thing as it kissed her fingers. Jon stood there already, his breath a simple ghost. He didn't look at her when he spoke. "My sister does not trust you." "Does she trust you?" Daenerys asked. He made a sound that could have been a laugh. Some days not. I've not given her good reasons to trust me." "You let yourself be murdered for doing what you thought was right," she said. "It does not make people comfortable." "She has had to be uncomfortable," Jon said. "That's why the North still stands." He drew a breath that frosted the guardstone. "Tell me true. If we live, you'll ask us to bend the knee." She looked out at the white world. "If we live, I will ask for a world that does not produce men who think burning children is governance. I will ask for oaths and I will make them mutual. If the North demands a queen who keeps a promise and does not break the people who keep hers, I suspect the shape of the throne will matter less than the shape of the rule that stands on it." She looked at him then. "But I will not kneel to you, and you will not kneel to me while the dead are walking. We haven't time for the theater." He nodded once. "Good." The ravens came thick as fall's last leaves and blacker than a heart full of secrets. Eastwatch had seen a line of dead men marching along the edge of the world, where the sea knit itself to the land in frozen lace. The wall held, but the sea did not. The Whites had found a path where the ice froze hard overnight and hung on the stones where waves had left salt to sketch their edges. "They learn," Tormund Giantsbane said, spitting into the snow. "They don't eat and they don't rut and they don't sing, but they learn." They marched before dawn under a sky weighty with cloud. The Unsullied moved like a clean-cut seam through the flurrying world. The northern levies shook into order around their surety. There were men from Bear Island whose leather had been mended with bone needles, and whose axes had been their grandfathers. There were men with salted bread in their satchels, and a bit of ribbon tied around a wrist from a wife. Dothraki rode hunched and furious in the snow, swearing in round open vows at a world that trapped hooves in drifts like snares. East of Long Lake they made their first stand. The whites came in a wave that broke and kept breaking against the spear points, a wave that brought with it the stink of ruptured cold, and something chemical from the corpse process that did not belong to nature. Grey Worm's voice cut rhythm from the air, commands a man could climb like a ladder. The Unsullied's shields became one beast, scaled in iron. Northern spearmen slotted into the gaps like teeth in a jaw. Fire danced at the stake lines, licked at oil-soaked ropes, ran through trenches where straw had been laid with a quartermaster's exactness. Daenerys and Jon took the sky. Drogon's heat was a huge living thing between her knees. When he exhaled, the world beneath him changed shape. Jon leaned low over Rhaegal's neck, and they moved like a thought. One of the dragon's old scars had whitened along his flank like a healed river. They did not burn in sheets. They burned in music, and their notes were patterns made of air and heat, and the way a body fills space when it chooses to end another body's claim upon it. 100 whites became 50, became 25, became nothing. Behind the burning, the ones without fire in them kept walking with the same hungry patience. Back! Grey Worm's voice cut twice in Valyrian and once in the common tongue, a tether for men about to panic. Hold the gap, he called to the men from Carhold where the shield line buckled and recovered. Close, he told the Unsullied at his back, and they closed. A giant white came through the white murk like a memory of an older planet. Its eyes burned the same wrong blue as all the others. Its jaw hung crooked, and its movement had an unnatural angle to it, as if the strings on a puppet had been knotted by hands indifferent to symmetry. It hit the left flank shield line and ran over men like a cart. Dothraki arrows struck it and struck without visible result. Brienne of Tarth put herself and the white bear she rode between it and the long-limbed boy from the Chronoclans. She raised her sword two-handed and deflected an arm like a tree trunk, and when she fell she rolled with the precision of a woman who had made a study of falling. "Now," said Tyrion from behind a cart where he had no business being, in a scorpion bolt, one of Qyburn's own devices stolen and improved, refashioned to fit on a cart's bed, and fired with a winch wound by two men with strong backs and good balance, drove through the giant's eye and out the hot, cold back of its skull. The giant fell like a tower. Its corpse shook the ground, and then shook again as the magic that had made it special let go in a sharp, dry crack. They did not win so much as they outlasted that day. When night forced them back, they fell back in order. The Unsullied's retreat a taut geometry. Grey Worm's shoulders burned with the ache of the shield's leather biting into them. His face was a place where no expression lived because there was nothing he had that he could give to expression and still keep his men. In the retinue's tents, men drank hot water as if it were wine and shivered until their bones stopped hopping in their flesh. Missandei moved from palate to palate, a sluice of warm words in one tongue, and then another. She washed blood crusted like icing from a young Mormont's hair. He had a scarecrow's build and a child's hands. When he realized she was not Dornish, nor Winterfell, but from a land he had seen only in the slanted drawings at the Citadel, he stared at her as if she might also breathe water. "I thought you'd be a queen," he said. "I am not a queen," she replied. "I work for one." "What's it like?" His teeth chattered. "Working for a queen." "Like working for Winter," she said. "You think it is going to be something else, and then you learn it is mostly work." That night, Daenerys went to the smithy's lean-to that had been rigged to keep the wind at bay. Gendry worked by lamp, bare arms red to the elbow, the muscles in them jumping like fish. "If you need me," she said, and didn't know what she wanted from him. An answer? A promise? A miracle of metallurgy? "I need time," he said without looking up. "And heat, your grace. And someone to carry this box to the men who can shoot straight, and someone else to tell them not to waste arrows trying to kill something that's already dead with anything but this." He lifted an obsidian-headed arrow and looked at it with something like tenderness. "We're all going to die," he added conversationally. "But it would be good to take a few with us. See, I would prefer not to die." Daenerys said. He grinned despite the worry in his eyes. Hey, you and me both. The ravens came again. Eastwatch had not fallen, but it had bent. The sea froze more nights than it did not. The dead were testing. They have patience, Bran Stark said, as if reciting from a page only he could see. He looked at Daenerys, and she felt herself seen with the clarity of cold water. His face was still a boy's face, but his eyes were a map with pieces of forest that didn't exist anymore. They'll come for me sooner or later. He made it a fact. Then we set the trap, Jon said. They set it at Winterfell. The Godswood was an old red mouth carved in a face of white that had been bleeding a long time. They ringed it with trenches, with spike pits, with lines of oil waiting for a spark. They threaded ropes between the trees and strung bells that would ring only in a certain wind. The Unsullied set their lines with care. Northern men with axes tested the stakes and nodded when they trusted them. Women went to the crypt with knives and the old blunt anger of people who had buried too many and opened too few cupboards without also opening shame. Sansa directed food and firewood with a general's eye for fatigue. When she and Daenerys met in the corridor outside the kitchens, they paused like two cats on different stairs. You brought bread, Sansa said, and restraint. You brought a people who remember how to be a people, Daenerys said. Don't make the mistake of thinking we remember it because it was easy, Sansa said. We remember it because we had to. We will not forget that you came when there was no glory to be had in it. I did not come for glory, Daenerys said, and heard in her own voice the sharp truth of it. I came because I have had enough of men who love the sound of their own names more than they love breathing. Sansa's mouth softened. On that, we are sisters. The day the dead came, the wind cut clean and unchanging out of the north. Snow fell in a steady pageant with no edge to it. The bells in the Godswood did not ring because the strings had frozen a little, and that was its own warning. Arya Stark stood on a roof spine with a bow and a quiver and a knife with a memory. She watched the first line of white shapes emerge from the white world and said nothing at all. Grey Worm stood with the front rank of Unsullied shield edge cutting a line into the world that the dead could not see and therefore would not respect. He studied the way their feet moved, the way they stumbled and then corrected, the way the big ones, once giants, once men with shoulders meant for pulling plows, pushed at the line like a cart's wheel through mud. Hold, he said, and the sound traveled along the shields. Bran sat under the heart tree, the red leaves moving against his hair like old hands stroking a brow. He blinked, and the world went away. When he saw again, he saw as the ravens saw, the wave and the break of it, the cold and the darker cold at its center. The Night King came through the snow like a perfectly made blade. He did not move faster than anyone else. He moved with a precision that made speed feel unnecessary. He looked where he was going, and where he was going was a boy under a tree. Drogon and Rhaegal descended roaring, and the air twisted under their wings. Fire poured from them in curtains. The Night King walked into it with the perfect calm of an idea. He raised his hand and the fire divided for him as if he were a stone in a river. Daenerys felt Drogon's disbelief as a twitch in the muscles of his neck. She gritted her teeth and pulled him up and away, her fury a live thing that did not help. "Now!" Jon shouted, and Rhaegal folded like a hawk falling on a mouse. Jon dropped, stumbling as his boots hit snow that had not been there a second before, and ran. Longclaw was a long cold line in his hand. The Night King turned his face toward him, almost as if bored. Ice formed on the guard stone where Jon's breath touched it. He brought the sword down, and the Night King parried with nothing. There was no blade in his hand, and Jon felt the shock of perfectly opposed purposes move through his bones like sound. Arya was already moving. She had learned to move while no one watched. She had learned to jump while the air held her and to land while it forgave her. She ran along the top of a wall, and her shadow was a smear. The Valyrian steel dagger rode her palm, and her breath made no sound. The Night King lifted his hand with the grace of a man at a dance, and at the same moment Grey Worm shouted something in Astapori, and the Unsullied's left wing broke open like a sleeve unrolled. Daenerys threw herself sideways on Drogon's back, and he answered, rolling over his own shoulder and coming up with a scream of rage. Viserion, who had circled to rake a trench with fire, came lower than he should have. An icicle the size of a wagon lance flicked in the air and took him in the wing. He shrieked, and Daenerys felt the echo in her bones, since dragon and rider were one story told in two bodies. Viserion crashed into the trench's far edge, snow rising like spun glass. "Go," she told Drogon, and he went. He raked fire across the ground between Jon and the Night King in a pattern she could have drawn afterward with a stick in sand. A narrow line, a sudden widening, a clean edge stopping just shy of a man's boots. Jon stumbled and regained his feet, eyes streaming in the heat. The Night King stepped through the fire, which took him as one might take the edge of a cloak to keep it out of the mud. Arya flew. The dagger was a bright thought in her hand. He moved like the end of a sentence, pivoted with a precision that turned her leap into a fall. His hand closed around her throat, and the world went narrower than a wrist. She let go of the dagger with the hand he held and caught it with the other as if it had always known the way. She drove it toward his face, and his other hand lifted, slow and inevitable. Jon hit him from the side like a man throwing himself into a river, and not minding if he drowned as long as he carried the right stone with him. Longclaw met a surface that was not steel, and not ice and not bone, but a concept wearing a body. It bit. The Night King turned his head, a fractional acknowledgement. Daenerys saw, knew she could not kill him with fire, understood in the same breath that she could break the shape of the moment. "Down," she told Drogon, and he went as a hawk goes toward blood. His shoulder hit the Night King like a wall. It did not break him, but it moved him a hand's breadth, and in that hand's breadth Arya's dagger slid under his ribs and up, and Jon's sword came down, and the sound it made was not a scream and not a crack. It was the soft relief one hears when ice gives on a river, and moves, and after it there is space where there was only certainty. The Night King was there, and then he was shards. He did not shatter like glass. He came apart like a thought abandoned. The whites started to fall. They fell as wind falls, suddenly, as if someone had breathed in after holding a breath too long. The giant whose skull had been caved in earlier collapsed into slack meat. Men stood panting in a sudden quiet that was terrible in its size. It took a long time before the quiet learned how to be anything else. When it did, it became weeping and laughter and the kind of tiredness that is an honorable debt. In the Godswood, the heart tree's leaves shivered, and Bran came back to himself as if from a long walk in someone else's winter. He looked at Arya as if at a book whose ending he had read and agreed with. She wiped the dagger on her sleeve with neat little motions. Jon leaned on Longclaw as if it were a crutch, his throat working. Daenerys slid from Drogon's back. Her hands shook. She put them on his warm jaw, and felt the rumble there come up through his bone. "You good beast," she whispered. Viserion struggled in the trench and then found his feet again, his torn wing dragging like a broken sail. He was alive. The pain in him was a shape she could have drawn with her eyes closed. The dead did not rise again. They burned their own, and then there were words to say and food to find for men who could not look at a bowl without imagining it was a grave. Lyanna Mormont had killed a giant with an arrow through its remaining living eye. She lay on a plank and the women of Bear Island sang to her in a language with a lot of salt in it. Sansa stood at Daenerys' shoulder while the bodies turned to ash, and when she spoke, her voice was more tired than either of them had words for. "You kept your word," she said. "So did you," Daenerys answered. "You kept your people alive." Sansa's mouth twisted a little, as if the kindness were a too tight boot. "And now?" "Now we feed them," Daenerys said. "And then I go south." She could feel it like a second winter, Cersei's hunger. The realm's habit of loving a strong hand because a strong hand promised to keep wolves from the door by chaining the wolves, and occasionally the children who liked them. "I will not leave a viper in the hearth because I like the shadow it casts." Sansa looked at her for a long time. "The North will not kneel," she said at last. "But the North might choose." Jon stood with Bran and Samwell Tarly in a small room that smelled of old ink and new smoke. The truth of his birth passed among them like a cup of water in a desert. His mouth did not move. His eyes were steady. "It changes the name," he said at last. "It doesn't change what I have to do." He went to Daenerys and told her the shape of it without the poetry other men would have used to make it feel better. "I am your family twice over," he said. "By the people who made me, and by the people who made me alive again. And I am your rival if you want a rival, and your ally if you want a realm and not just a chair. Nor and I me." Daenerys listened and felt something old crack in her like lake ice at the edge of spring. She did not trust it. That was all right. She did not need to trust it to make a choice. "I do not want a chair," she said. "I want a world in which a girl does not have to learn a knife like a lullaby, and a boy who tells the truth does not die for it. Help me make it." She smiled, shocked by how like pain it felt. "And if you want me to fight you for the right to sit on a carved thing afterward, then we can make a spectator's sport of it." He laughed, quick and unwilling. "You like to draw the poison from a wound?" he said. "I like to choose the knife," she said. Through the late winter, the living taught themselves how to be not at war without ignoring the fact of hunger. The Unsullied drilled in snow until their sandals lost some skin from their soles, and the smiths lined them with old leather. Grey Worm learned what frostbite looked like before it took, passed the knowledge down the ranks, made men show their feet to the healers even when pride wanted quiet. He held Missandei's hands in a corner of the great hall and told her, in a voice only she could hear, about a beach with black butterflies and how water there was warm, even in the very early morning. "We will go there," she said, and believed it enough to make it a real country. Ravens flew south with words, some to Highgarden that would never be answered, because Jaime Lannister had taken it with that fatal mixture of competence and loyalty that made him the best weapon in a queen's hand and the worst man for his own heart. Lady Olenna's last cup had been bitter and sweet. Some to Dorne, where no sand snake would answer, because Cersei had found her theater. Some to the Iron Bank, which had its own arithmetic. Some to Storm's End, whose garrison looked at winter creeping and made cautious choices, and sent back only silence. Cersei sat in the Red Keep with her crown a loop of cold gold on her sharp hair. She asked Qyburn how many men the Golden Company could bring, and when he told her, she asked how many ships would carry them. "Enough," he lied in the pleasant, smooth way of a man who has forgotten the difference between lies and medicine. Euron preened and promised. Jaime's jaw clenched like a fist. His eyes had the dull shine of a stained coin. "She comes," Cersei said to no one, watching an ant cross a windowsill, its body precise. "The girl comes with her horde and her monsters and her thought that she is special because she has not yet learned how to lose." In Winterfell's yard, Daenerys watched the Unsullied spears move from one configuration to another like a flock. Snow glittered in their eyelashes. She had learned them in heat. She was learning them again in cold. Jon came to stand with her with his gloved hands empty and his breath a feeble ghost. "They love you," he said, and it was not flattery and not criticism, only an observation like the way the cold had a smell. "They love order," she said. "They love that if they do a thing properly, they will be praised, and if they do it poorly, they will be taught, and if they do it very poorly, they will be corrected until they know how to do it properly. The world did not offer them that before. Rules are holy when chaos has been a god." He glanced at her profile. "And what do you love?" "Heat," she said, and smiled. "And the sound of a lie finishing itself, and the places where a road begins." When the first buds showed on the apple trees down near the hot springs, they began to move. The wagons rolled with the slow stubbornness of wagons. The northern levies shook out into long gray threads along the King's Road. The Dothraki sang under their breath for the first time in months, and their songs sounded like old leather and love. The Unsullied kept count of their dead by keeping their formations seamless where those men would have been. Missandei walked beside Grey Worm with a list of villages to pass, and a list of wells to use, and a list of men to send ahead to make certain there was no ambush at the next bridge. Sansa watched them go with her hand on the stone of Winterfell, and Arya stood a little distance away and did not wave. Bran watched with eyes that saw 1,000 lines of march and knew too much for waving. Daenerys took to the sky. The road unrolled ahead of her like a ribbon that had been put away and forgotten too long. The north held its breath while she moved south. Somewhere beyond the turn of the world, a woman with short hair and a crown of a different century sat at a window and stroked the edge of a goblet with a fingertip and smiled. Somewhere to the right of that, a man with a golden hand put on black armor and told himself the story of a better ending. The phalanx's black points shone faintly, as if each had stolen a bit of night and would return it later. The wolves of the north and the dragon of the south traveled down the King's Road together, as if it had been built precisely for them, and had only waited this long to see its purpose fulfilled. Wind roughed their banners. Mud took their footprints and made a record of their passing that would be gone when the rain decided it was time. They moved under a sky in which the season had turned and would turn again, and the breath of the realm came with them. Cautious, a little warmer now, and hopeful, because hope is what people have when someone has broken a terrible thing and left something like a path in the brokenness. Daenerys looked south and did not think of thrones. She thought of rooms where children slept, because their mothers were no longer afraid of what might come up the road. She thought of men who would put down their spears and find their hands were still capable of gentleness. She thought of fire, and the shape it makes when it is contained by a hearth and not by spite. Drogon's body warmed her thighs through leather and wool, and when he cried out, the sound was not angry. It was a promise extended to a far horizon. On, she told them all, and the word moved from her mouth to the dragon's wings, to the spear points, to the boots that broke the day's thin crust of dried mud on the road's shoulder. The army went on, and the kingdom with it, toward a city that had not yet learned how to be afraid of the right things, and toward a reckoning that would be made not in ash, if she could help it, but in the hard coin of what men choose when they are watched.